get started, just one comment I wanted to make. It has become very interesting to me over the years, as a funeral director, how many things we do today as a tradition that came out of the 1800s as a superstition. And as we go through, I think most of it will be obvious to you. I'll probably point out a few things as we go along. I want to read you a paragraph. It says, "When the place was packed full, the undertaker, he slid around in his black gloves with his softly soothing ways, putting on the last touches and getting people and things all shipshape and comfortable, and making no more sound than a cat. He never spoke. He moved people around, he squeezed in the late ones, he opened up passageways, and done it all with nods and signs with his hands. Then he took his place over against the wall. He was the softest, glidingest, stealthiest man I've ever seen, and there weren't no more smiles to him than a ham." Sound like a funeral director, do you know? Do you know who wrote that? Mark Twain. Mark Twain in 1884, The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn. And yet it describes today's funeral director. Talking about the Victorian era, those early deaths in the early 1800s, a lot to do with poor sanitation, contaminated water, and if only you understood the lifestyle of the settlers in those days, it only bred all the types of diseases that you can almost imagine. Children, all quite frequently, were victims of nutritional deficiency and diarrhea. Literally, 1 in every 5 children born never saw their first birthday. Let's go one step further. 50% of those children that were born never saw their 5th birthday. A lot of deaths of the youth. And then there were those so-called diseases of childhood: measles, whooping coughs, mumps. You want to know something? Without antibiotics, even teething was dangerous. Let's talk about some social deaths. We talked about medical deaths. What about social deaths? Did you know that very, very few people knew how to swim in the 1800s? I've read a lot of epitaphs in my day. Epitaphs are very interesting because they'll tell you something about that individual that's buried there. It'll either tell you about his life or his death. But understand this epitaph when we're talking about the number of children that died during the Victorian era. It says, "Youth behold and shed a tear. 14 children are buried here." Can you imagine a family losing 14 children? Goes on to say, "See their image, how they shine, like flowers of a fruitful vine." Social deaths, there was the swimming, children at play. How many fell out of a tree? How about playing in that hayloft? That's always fun to do, or wasn't it? How many of them fell out of a hayloft? But the thing is, I know that you know this, because I know you've told other people about it. And you look at me saying, "I don't know you. How do you know what I've told other people?" But let's try this one on for size. Jack and Jill went up the hill. to fetch a pail of water. Jack fell down and... Okay, great. Medical terms would be a fracture. Crown, poetic for either head or skull. This was a nasty hill that Jack just tumbled down. He got a skull fracture out of it. And don't think it was just clumsy old Jack. This was a nasty hill because Jill came tumbling after. You want to know how they fixed or they took care of skull fractures in the 1800s? The second verse will tell you. Jack got up and home he trot as fast as he could caper. They put him to bed and plastered his head with vinegar and brown paper. That was the children. What about the adults? The adults had the diseases, malaria, typhoid fever, yellow fever. What about tuberculosis? Consumption. The other term? There was decline. It was called decline and the Great White Plague. I had somebody bring me the death certificate from his great-grandfather. And he says, I don't understand the cause of death on here. It said the Great White Plague. And I says, that's tuberculosis. Tuberculosis killed as many people as any other disease that ran through the 1800s. Not only the medical deaths, but what about social deaths? How many women died in childbirth? The farmer get kicked by a horse, fell under his combine. Don't think this is uncommon, but when there was a spat at home, how many times did that man fling that fiery lantern at his wife? Don't worry about it. The ladies got even. Because how many times they put strychnine in his meal? And without forensic science in those days, there's a lot of ladies that got away with murder. You know what I'm talking about when I talk about those hooped skirts? Full length, clear to the floor. You lean to the right, it goes to the left. To the left, it goes to the right. You lean backwards and that skirt just goes right out in front. How many mothers reach down to help a small child and that skirt went back into an unprotected fireplace? And oh, those crinoline bloomers. They went up so fast. And if you only realize that happened in the back. It took a little while before she realized what had happened. The death in those days usually happened at home, surrounded by the family. Just as soon as the death took place, there was a hush that fell over the house. There was that stiff formality of overladen with gloom. You whispered, and you walked on your tiptoes. The first thing they would do at the time of death is open up all the windows so the soul is not hindered from going heavenward. The curtains were drawn because if you were in a house of mourning and sun shined on your face, you'd be the next one to die. Now, I told you, superstitions of the 1800s carried over in traditions of the 1900s. When was the last time you went to a funeral home for a visitation and the room where the body was either had no windows in it or the curtains were drawn? Why? Because that's the way we always did it. Tradition. The pictures would all be turned face down because death is in that house. And we don't want him to be reminded of you because he might think about you as his next victim. The mirrors would be covered because if you saw the reflection of the deceased in a mirror, you were the next to die. And oh, if you dropped that mirror. We aren't talking 7 years bad luck in the 1800s. If you dropped a mirror that you saw your reflection in, you have killed your reflection. And consequently, shortly, you're going to die. At the moment of death, we stopped all the clocks. If you did not, that would bring back bad luck. Remember the old song, My Grandfather's Clock? When it stopped short, never to go again when the old man died. You have just witnessed why undertakers don't sing at funerals. I was serious about that. The woman of the house would be the first one to make any gestures towards that body. The first thing she would do is close those eyes. The reason for that is, remember, death is always looking for somebody else. And he would be looking out through those eyes, looking for anybody else that he could take with him. Would you like to venture a guess why the eyes are closed on a body today? There's no need for it. They say, oh, we're making him look like he's sleeping, then why aren't we putting him in PJs? No, tradition. And understand, you can make a body look natural with these eyes open. You don't need to close them, but it's part of tradition. The other thing she would do is straighten out all the limbs, because remember, within 1 to 3 hours, rigor mortis was going to set in. And we wanted that body to look as natural and as relaxed as possible. Once rigor mortis sets in, it's kind of hard to move the limbs around to make them look natural. And then last of all, the cloth that they wrap around the head and tie to hold the jaw closed for the very same reason, because of rigor mortis. Okay. We've got everything squared away around the house. Now we got to let everybody else know what's going on. First thing you do is make a large wreath out of laurel with a big black ribbon on it. If it was a child, it would be a white ribbon. And you would hang that on your front door so as passerbys went by, they would know, hey, a death has occurred here. One of the other things you would do is notify the church or whatever to ring the mort bell. The reason for the mort bell was because, remember, death is still in that house and looking for somebody else. And at that time, they didn't know when the soul might leave the body. And if that evil spirit was there, he would be able to grab it just as soon as it left the body. They believed that ringing the mort bell would scare evil spirits away. Not only that, but it also, in a smaller community especially, would let you know who died. If it was an adult, it was the tenor bell that was used. If it was a child, it was the treble bell. So by that, all of a sudden, now you know it's an adult or a child, okay? If it was for a man, it would ring 3 times. A woman, 2 times. So now we know adult, child, male, female. And then after a short pause, it would ring once for each year of age of the individual. So we heard a treble bell, child. It rang 9, 9-year-old. You know, I heard the Jenkins boy fell out of a tree yesterday afternoon, and he wasn't doing very good. I'll bet. Or it rang twice with a tenor bell, an adult female, and it rang 23 times. You know, I hear that the Mitchell wife, she's due any day. Do you suppose? And yes, that's where we got the phrase, for whom the bell tolls. So not only the bells they felt would scare away the evil spirits, but in those days they would arrange around the coffin candles for the very same reason. You go to a funeral home today, certain religions, there are still candles around the coffin. That's where it began. Of course, today, they also use it for different religious connotations also. I forgot to light my candles. Does anybody have a lighter? Oh, never mind. That's getting even for before this.
Well, at least you're in your suit now.
There we go. In the early 1800s, caring for the dead was considered personal. So it was usually the family that took care of the body and prepared it for burial. As time went by, a community would come together to help out. And one of the first things you would do is bathe the body to get it ready, to get it dressed and for burial. And in those days, then, they would use 2 people that were the same sex as the deceased to take care of the body and to lay it out for burial. As time went by, it was very interesting that one gentleman in the community kind of did it a little bit better. He took a little more time at it and had Dad looking so nice. And when there was another death, they would say, you know, I think I'd like to have him come over when Mom dies because things look so nice. And so they'd call that gentleman over to undertake the responsibilities of laying out the dead. One of the first things, well, I should say, as he got better at his services and was called more frequently, yes, he would be given, first of all, an honorarium by the family, I'm sure. Some type of a monetary gift. And then later on, he would start charging for his services as an undertaker. One of the first things that he would have purchased or have obtained is a cooling board. Right here. This is a cooling board. The reason for the cooling board, first of all, it got the body out of bed. Remember, families family's going to be coming in. Remember, family's going to be coming in the next few days, and they're going to need that deathbed for them to be able to have a bed to sleep in. Secondly, now the body's on wheels. We can move it around a little bit easier. Find a little brighter place or spot in the room so they could shave a little easier, or maybe move the body into the parlor or something like that, and go ahead and lay the body out and get it ready for burial. One of the other things that the undertaker would, one of the first things he would get, any ideas? For the chin. It would be slipped into the nostrils, and then this pad would be slipped up and down so the mouth would be held at the proper position before rigor mortis set in. And that's usually where the body would remain then until a coffin was built. And in the earlier days, that would usually be done by a member of the family or a neighbor. It wasn't too long after that one of the next items the undertaker would get was what was called a corpse cooler. It was made out of wood, and it fit around the trunk of the body and up over the shoulders. And then there was a gap on the inside, about like that, and then there was a galvanized lining. And what they would do is tuck ice chips in there to help keep the body cool and keep it from decomposition as long as possible. That corpse cooler could also follow them into the coffin. And just to explain to you, ice was extremely expensive. No refrigeration in those days. The only ice that was available were for those people that went down to the lakes or the ponds in the wintertime and harvested ice, brought that home and put it in their ice house, and then stuffed it full of straw, sawdust, whatever, so it was insulated, and they would literally have ice that would carry them through until the next season. But they wanted to make sure they had ice till the next season, so they didn't want to give it up that easily. Ice, extremely expensive. So one of the other things they would do to help keep the ice as long as possible is they would put a lid on the coffin and nail it down as tight as they could to keep that cold air in. And then what would happen, don't do this to me, there would be a little window in the top of the coffin where they would come and look down and view the deceased. One of the early ways that they used for preserving, quote, embalming a body was either soaking it in arsenic or alcohol. The story is of a lady, her husband died, and she submerged his body in a tin coffin filled with whiskey. And she stored it under her bed until spring, when that body could be sent by train or by rail to Illinois to be buried in the springtime. Ever hear of Admiral Lord Nelson? I see a few heads shaking. Yes. In 1805, he was killed by a French sniper while he was leading an attack on the French and Spanish Armada. They needed to get his body back to England. Now, one of the main exports to the old country was alcohol. Whiskey, rum, brandy, you name it. Well, they submerged his body into a keg of rum, sent it back to England. Got back to England, and which keg was that in now? It was sent to a local pub. And it was drank dry by the patrons there. When they took that keg down to bring a new one in, they thought, man, this is heavier than a normal empty keg. And they opened it, and they found the body of Admiral Lord Nelson. Even today, pubs of England, it is not uncommon at all that when they replace a keg of alcohol, they refer to it as tapping the Admiral. Contagious diseases runs rampant in these days. Just to give you an idea, during the Crimean War, 1861 to 1864, the British deaths totaled, try to keep these numbers straight in your mind if you can. Their death total was 21,097. Okay? Those that were killed in action was 2,755, a little over 10%. Those that died of their wounds later, 2019, a little under 10%. So you put those two numbers together, you basically have 20% of the total. So what happened to the other 16,323? They died of disease, poor sanitation. You get a disease in a camp like that and it would run rampant. Same way with a lot of communities in the early settlements, smallpox, diphtheria, scarlet fever, yellow fever. They needed a way of controlling it. They noticed England didn't have near the problem. So they checked it out. And they found out that England was doing a process called arterial embalming, circulating a preservative fluid through the arterial system. And if you do that, it goes to absolutely every cell in the body. And at that point, the disease was killed. It didn't go on any further. That body was not infectious anymore. We're coming into the 1850s. Not only that great white plague running rampant, but now we're into the Civil War. And this was really the beginning of when embalming fluid was coming around to be. Between the 1840s and 1860s, a lot of people were playing with different types of chemicals for preservation. Dr. Thomas Holmes, which we consider the father of embalming. He was a doctor. He knew something about anatomy in those days. He was a pharmacist. He knew a lot about chemicals and what worked with each other. And in the 1840s, he also worked with the New York Coroner's Office. So he was intrigued by all of this. And after experimenting with a lot of different methods and a lot of different fluids type thing, he finally started advertising himself as an embalmer of the dead to the general public. He received his commission from the Army Medical Corps, and he was sent to Washington, D.C. to embalm officers, that were killed in the Civil War so they could be sent back home to their families and buried with the family. President Lincoln heard about this, how effective it was, and he says, no, not just the officers, everybody that died in the Civil War, if there was a way to embalm them so they could go back to their families. Obviously, you know about the big cemeteries at Gettysburg and all of those. No, all of them couldn't get back to a place that would handle embalming. Dr. Thomas Holmes himself just operated out of Washington, D.C., so it was not easy to get everyone embalmed. But they did as many of them as they could. One of the things that accelerated the idea of arterial embalming to the general public was the fact Abraham Lincoln was assassinated. His body was embalmed. And if you remember that slow 2-week trek throughout the United States, allowing the public to pay their last respects to this president before they got back to Springfield, Illinois for the burial. And we saw how effective it was with Abraham Lincoln, and that's really when it took off here in the throughout the country. I need to go over there. Is it going to let me?
I know.
Later on, when embalming became more popular, remember, everything was done at home. So this cooling board ended up also later on being an embalming table. Body would be placed on the table, and what you do as far as arterial embalming is find a major artery. The ones that are usually used is the carotid, the subclavian, the axillary, the brachial, the radial, femoral, and in the foot, the pedal. And wherever there's a major artery, there's also a major vein that runs right along beside it. So what you would do is usually make an incision about an inch and a half long, bring that artery to the surface. And what they would do is insert a cannula into the artery and then tie it off so it couldn't leak. Okay? It was connected to a jar where the fluid was mixed. And then they had something like a syringe like this with valves on it, so when you drew the syringe back, it would bring the fluid into the syringe, and then when you pushed it, that valve would close, this one would open, and allow it to go out through the body. Pretty simple, right? A little bit later, hey, we saw something like this. Same process. That undertaker had to have some good muscles. Later on, and literally, clear through the 1940s, 1950s, you would see a gravity bottle. The fluid would be mixed in the bottle, and because of the gravity, it would pull that solution out. And then the cannula would be hooked up to the tube here and into the artery. If we needed a little more pressure, all you had to do with the gravity bottle is pull it up a little bit higher, and gravity would pull it even a little stronger. Now that's all wonderful, right? Takes about takes about 3 gallons of fluid to embalm a body. You pump 3 gallons of fluid into a body, you're going to get a lot of distension, a lot of puffiness, especially around the soft tissue like the eyes, things like that. That don't work. So what they would do is open up that vein that traveled along beside that artery, and they would slip a drain tube into that vein and down into chamber of the heart, mainly because the heart, they consider, or we consider, the center of circulation. You got better control. And then you open it up and allow that pressure to be drained into a collection jar like that. When it got full, you would take that jar out and dump it. Now, about 1878 is when embalming fluid was first manufactured in volume and distributed. It was the Champion Fluid Company out of Ohio, still in business today. I've used Champion Fluid. This is a bottle from the Champion Fluid Company. Now, the interesting thing about this is for the first few years, their bottles were not threaded. There was not a screw top on it. It was a cork. Okay? When I lived back in Laverne, Minnesota, I had a good buddy that was kind of an amateur treasure hunter. He liked to do the metal detectors and all of that. And he's kicking around an old farmstead through the trash pit, and he found this bottle. Gave it to me, one of my treasured possessions. That tells us several things. First of all, it tells us that there was a death in that house. Secondly, it tells us that they embalmed it right there at the house. And I can almost tell you when that death occurred, because from 1878, only for a few years, the bottles were not threaded. And yes, this one, the cork is still in there. How cool is that? This is a 16-ounce bottle, and that would be diluted down to about 3 gallons of water to make the fluid. It's interesting that even though the Civil War is over and everything, the types of fluids that they used were based on salts. And it wasn't until 1859 that formaldehyde was discovered by a Russian scientist, Alexander Butlerov. That's not bad. But after that, now they have a pretty cheap solution that they can use now with a very effective way of preserving a body. Not only that, but it was cheaper than ice. And a lot more effective, a lot more dependable. Okay, the body's been embalmed. Do you know who the first competition was for an undertaker? What's that? Taxidermist? Last time I asked this group of questions. The furniture maker. He knew how to work with wood. He made all this furniture. So yes, they went to the furniture maker and said, "Can you make a coffin for us, for Dad?" He realized that if he perfected his abilities as an undertaker and then to sell a coffin besides, can you see where he's making a little bit more money? Now, I can tell by some of the gray hair here that many of you are old enough to remember in the smaller communities, how many times was the furniture store and the funeral home owned by the same people? All from the 1800s. The one thing about, well, let me just explain a coffin. You know that there is a difference between a coffin and a casket, don't you? Say yes.
Yes.
Okay, good.
Hinges.
A coffin is a six-sided receptacle. Wider at the shoulders, narrower at the head, or the head and the feet. We call them toe pinchers. Understand, these were made, tailor-made for the deceased. They weren't standardized like caskets are today, okay? Measurements were extremely important. There was a gentleman that moved to Iowa. Where did he move to? Johnson County, Iowa, near Iowa City, to open up a cabinet shop and a coffin shop. And if you were to go into one of these shops and looked over in the corner, you would see a lot of his past history as far as making coffins, because there would be a stack of old measuring sticks back in the corner. They would go over to the house. Now this one says Jerry Kaufman's wife. You want to get the right one for the right measurements, don't you? July 20, 1880. 15, 26, 14, 13 plenty high, 12 will do. He would go to the house and he would cut this stick to the exact height of the individual. So he knew that his coffin had to be a few inches longer than this. And it goes on to say 15 inches. Well, that's across the head. The 26 across the shoulders, and 14 across the feet. 13 high, we're talking about the side of it, but he says on here, 12 will do. There is the story of the elderly lady that died way back in the hill country. Middle of the winter, January, the coldest ever, the snowiest ever. And the family tied her body to a hand sleigh and ran it down to the closest community that had a cabinet maker to make that coffin. Well, her body was laid in the back room of the shop while he did his building. Builds this nice coffin. Oh, look nice. Now it's time to lay her body in there. And as he did, he realized it wouldn't fit. He sat back and contemplated this grave mistake. Did you catch that one? I want you to stay with me here. What am I going to do? They're expecting the body this afternoon. The funeral is set. This, that, and everything else. And finally, after a while, he gets up, walks over to his workbench, and pulls out a handsaw. Cuts off the feet. He tucks them down into the bottom of the coffin, and he nails this lid on really tight. Takes it over the house. Oh, the family, they were so delighted with the coffin and everything. They set it up in the parlor. And after a little while, they looked back and said, Mama looks like she's about 2 feet shorter than others. Yeah, come on. It's not going to get better. So at that point, then he explained what had happened and said, you know how frugal Mom was. You wouldn't want to put her through any extra expense, would you? You know, in my mind, he was the one that made the mistake, not the family. So measurements were extremely important. Do you know how many times I go downtown to the local restaurant, meet somebody at the door, and they say, Mort, don't measure me up, I'm not ready to go. Happens all the time. Caskets are standardized now. They aren't. tailor-made, but still the phrase. The other one I hear all the time is, hey, digger, where's your tape measure? I like to tell them after 45 years, I can pretty well size them up without it. Traditionally, these carpenters, when they were done making a coffin, they would sweep up all the sawdust and all of the shavings and everything and put it into the bottom of the coffin. And it went with the coffin to the grave. Because they believed if any of that fell off at home or you brushed it off and it got onto somebody else, they would be the next one to die. So very important that they cleaned up afterwards and put it in the coffin. Okay, difference between a coffin and a casket. We talked about the coffin being six-sided. In the later 1800s, we start seeing these rectangular coffins, like you see today. And they named it a casket, because a casket was anything or a box that held something precious. If you go on eBay today and you type in casket and you don't put funerary or something like that after, you're going to get thousands of jewelry boxes and things like that you're going to be looking at. A casket means a box for something precious. And they couldn't think of a better term than it would be for a casket to put their loved one in. Okay, the coffin is made, the body is in it. It's in the parlor. Now we have to wake the dead. Wake the dead. What that meant is, and this is before embalming, don't get me wrong, that is where the family and friends and neighbors would relay, taking turns sitting up with the body 24 hours a day until the burial happened. They were terrified of being buried alive. And so you sat with that body and you watched just in case the chest might heave a little bit, or there's a little twitch in the eye or something like that. Maybe they were only in a coma. And before embalming, they literally waked the body till decomposition set in, because they knew once decomposition was set in, they were dead. Yes?
My mother used to say that the man was so large he had to use a piano box or something like that. But I don't know that a piano box would be big enough for us.
I don't know if it'd be strong enough either, to tell you the truth, but anyway.
Well, maybe it was a grand piano.
What was the question?
She had heard something in the past about someone was so big that they used a piano box. Well, I don't know. There's a lot of tales that come out of death. The one that I laugh at so much is, I knew somebody that saw somebody sit up in the casket. It don't happen. But those are tales that come about, obviously. So now the body is in the parlor. Family, friends, relatives would all start pouring in and give their condolences to the family in the room inside the door, and then they would be ushered into the parlor to view. Notice, notice, notice that family, all of them are wearing black. You notice all the friends that are coming in are wearing black? Do you notice the undertaker is wearing black? Do you notice the minister is wearing black? The main reason is they believe that death is standing at the foot end of that coffin. looking for someone else to take. And death can't see black. Black was camouflage. That allowed you to be in the presence of death and not have to be concerned about the spirit of death taking you. Why do we wear black today? It goes all the way back to the 1800s. It's a tradition. There's no reason for wearing black. It's just part of that tradition that has followed us down all these years. About the mid-1800s, there's a new technology that comes out. And somehow, this instrument can capture your image on a piece of glass. Photography. Very expensive again. So it just wasn't something you did all the time. But that came into the realm of death very quickly. Because how many people had their picture taken before death? They didn't have an image of their loved one. We talked about children. How many of them died? Yeah, they didn't have a chance to have their picture taken. Do you know that many people did not name their child for the first week because so many of them did not survive? Why go through the process until we're sure? So photography of the dead came into being. We look at it like, I don't know. But the way they saw it was, hey, a sad image is better than no image at all. They had something that they could hang on to. So we see a lot of pictures. Here's one with the little child in the coffin. How about twins? Remember, when those diseases ran through a community, they ran rapid. And take both of the twins? Yeah. Then they got to thinking, well, rather than taking a picture in a coffin, why don't we make them look like they're alive? So here we have one in a carriage. That's not bad. Here we have one that looks like she's asleep on the couch with her older sister sitting with her. All of these pictures will be up here afterwards if you want to come up and take a little closer look. Here it looks like a pair of twins again, but only one of them died. It looks like he's got his head laying on the other's shoulder.
Which one?
I'd like to say the one with his eyes open. But I can't say that because the photographer became very good at drawing and painting on eyes over a closed eyelid. In fact, they would give the little one a little blush or something like that. That was really the beginning of cosmetics for the undertaker. In those days, it was a watercolor that was used, and it didn't maintain its color that well. So the undertaker had to do the cosmetics early on in the visitation process so they would look as good as possible. Another one, this is natural. Mom holding the child. Here's one I want you to have a little closer look at. I don't know if you can see it. Looks like there's a child sitting in a chair. But if you look real closely, you can see the outline of a head underneath that sheet. Somebody is under a sheet, like a chair, to help prop up that little child so the picture could be taken. Here's one of a fireman. What do you notice different about this? He's standing up. how do you do that? Other than the fact that the photographer had a piece of equipment that would hold them up so they could take that picture. Like I said, they got to the point of wanting to have that little one look as natural as possible. What is more natural than a mother pretending to breastfeed? Now this is a picture that I found in a antique store, if I can put it that way. This is a copy of it. I got the original home. It ain't going out with me. On the back it says Judge Mack, December 23rd, 1889. Now, if you notice, we've got a lot of people in that picture, don't we? Remember, photography was extremely expensive, so if you needed a photographer, why don't you go ahead and plan a family portrait? I always say, if you're looking at a picture from the 1800s, if somebody's sitting up or laying in bed, you can be sure that one of them's dead. There was a soldier in the Civil War that got word that his baby had died, his son had died. And he rushed home as quickly as he could because he wanted a picture of his son being held in his arms. That individual James Abram Garfield, our 12th President of the United States.
What war was that?
Civil War. Hey, funerals, everything's been done at the house. In those days, even the funeral, just like weddings, was done at the house. Very interesting. When houses were built during this period of time, they knew, chances were good, I should say, that there was going to be a death in that house. So they built, off of the parlor, extra wide doors that would open to allow a casket or a coffin and pallbearers to carry that dead out. What would happen is they would carry the coffin out, put it into the hearse. Just real quickly, the hearse is the horse drawn. When it became motorized, it became a funeral coach. The difference between the two. But you still today hear people walking out of the church saying something about, are we supposed to follow the hearse or this or that or whatever. It's still referred to as a hearse. When they got back from the cemetery, they would immediately tear out that doorway and build over it so you couldn't tell that there was ever a doorway there. The reason for that is they believed, hey, death has been there once. He knows how to get back. And if we cover up the doorway, we're going to confuse death. He isn't going to be able to understand if that's the right house or how to get back into that house. And just to throw death off a little bit more, after that, that room was called the living room. Cemeteries, the early settlers had cemeteries, but they camouflaged them so you couldn't see. Basically trying to hide from those savage natives. How many of them in their settlement are dying? So they were camouflaged. Later on, the churchyard used to be the prominent place for cemeteries. Great, because between services, you could go out and wander through the cemetery, maybe even have a little picnic with your family. But the problem is, our churchyards were small. They filled up quickly. So what they would do is bring in dirt and raise the level of the cemetery by about 3 feet. Cover it with dirt up to a level of 3 feet, and then they would resell all of the graves all over again. Oh, we can't go any further talking about Victorian death without talking about real life. This is part of an article that came out of the Aberdeen Standard, newspaper out of Aberdeen, South Dakota. And it says, even if one is unwilling to go as far as the English investigator who estimated that 2,700 people, at least in England and Wales, are yearly consigned to the tomb while alive, and to accept the conclusions that premature burials in France are 2 per 1,000, it is nevertheless beyond question that the peril of live burials is actual and terrifying menace. It was a real fear in those days of being buried alive. Many of them put a clause in their wills. Here's a lady that put in her will that my body shall be stabbed to the heart to make sure that life is extinct. Here's a wealthy man. Oh, help me understand this one. At my death, a medical man shall make such experiments as may be necessary to make sure that life is extinct, and until the burial of my remains are to be watched over by 2 nuns. There were the diseases like cholera and diphtheria that would come into a community and highly contagious and just run rampant through a community. And death almost immediately. There's the one community that there was a young girl that was visiting, and she brought in diphtheria. And she died almost immediately, within hours. There was a wealthy family in the community by the name of Laguerre. And they says, we've got to dispose of this body immediately so it's not a threat to the rest of the community. You may put it in my tomb, my mausoleum, as we would say today. How many times there was a rapid disposition of the body, and then they sit back and think, what if it's only in a coma? Several years later, Laguerre's son was killed in the Civil War. And they opened that tomb to put his body in there, and behind the door was a skeleton of a small child. How often they were disposed of, and then think later, were they really dead? So live burials were very, very common. To counteract all of this, there was an association that was formed for the prevention of premature interments. And one of their suggestions was that everybody would be buried with a flask in their coffin that is lightly stoppered with chloroform in it. So even if they were buried alive, they could drift off to a peaceful death. Some of the other things. There's a gentleman that designed and patented a coffin that was made up with a bunch of wires and pins. And if there was any movement in that coffin, the spring-loaded lid would fly off. That was great before burial. Another one took it a step further, and all the pins and the wires and everything. But if they detected any motion in that coffin, it would unfurl a banner over the grave. They would know that, hey, there's a possibility that somebody is buried alive. Another one was a bell with a rope going down through the center of that coffin, wrapped around the hands of the deceased, so if there was any movement, it would ring the bell. That individual, if he was brought back from the dead by disinterring, he always referred to it as being saved by the bell. You knew that was coming, didn't you? Well, what about this one? You know, during the day, yeah, there was activity around the little community. They would hear the bell if it rang, but what about at night? So they would hire somebody to go out and sit at the cemetery and babysit the bell. And that individual always referred to it as having to work the graveyard shift. Last of all, let's talk a minute about grave robbers. Very common in the 1800s. I talked about epitaphs earlier. This one is an epitaph over a grave, but he's no longer there because of a grave robber. But it says, "The body snatchers, they have come and made a snatch at me. It's very hard them kind of me won't let a body be. Don't go and weep upon my grave and think that there I'll be. They haven't left there an atom of my anatomy." Who were body snatchers? Who were grave robbers?
They took the bodies to sell them to
Anatomy.
doctors.
Anatomy students.
Doctors were very, very guilty of grave robbing. Understand, if you're a doctor in this community and you're trying to help them as very best you can, but yet there are no anatomy charts available, no textbooks, and dissection was highly illegal, how are you going to learn? How are you going to treat these people? So yes, doctors were the ones that usually would go out and dig up a fresh grave, so they had a specimen to study. And I don't know who else said it, anatomical students. They dug those up, the professors would, so they could teach their students a little more about anatomy.
What would you call the people that would want to take the jewelry? Would that still be?
Those are grave robbers too. A different type of grave robber, but they're going for the financial side of it though. A lot of cemeteries started hiring night watchmen to guard against this. One of the things, you know, usually they watched over fresh graves. You know what the other thing that was so common for doctors to want and need? Skeletal remains. How can you help somebody in your community if you don't know the structure that's underneath? Now their patients knew that this was going on. So when the patients came into a doctor's office and sat in a chair there, quite often the question would come up, do you have any hidden skeletons in your closet? I've got a couple of epitaphs I want to read to you just to finish up with. Again, they tell you a lot about the individual that's buried there. This happens to be an epitaph over a lady's grave that has been married twice. It says, "Here lies a wife of two husbands bereft, Robert on the right and Richard on the left." Here, you take this one however you want. It says, "Here lies Ezekiel Abel, age 102. The good die young." And here is a sad one. We're about done. Here's a sad one. I don't know if this was a town bum or what it was. But it says, here is where poor Henry lies. Nobody weeps and nobody cries. Where he went and how he fares, nobody knows and nobody cares. I know, isn't that terrible? I'd like to change that one. Oh, and here's the last one. Society looks at death as a failure. If I hadn't failed, I'd still be alive, wouldn't I? You hear the phrase, he battled cancer so bravely. Well, if you battle cancer and you die from it, you failed. And if this touches any of you, I mean, just understand, I'm talking history here. And I don't mean any negative about it. But death represents a failure. Life cannot go on any further. So what this epitaph says is, hey, whoever walks by is going to end up right where I'm at. It says, behold and see, as you pass by, as you are now, so once was I. As I am now, so you must be. Prepare for death and follow me. I've taken a little extra time. I'm going to be around afterwards. If you have questions, if you want to look at the photos, whatever you want to do, please feel free to come up.